This is part 2 of the Pre-Disaster Mitigation Grants Project webinar. Your presenter is Stephen Randolph with FEMA Region 10.
So hazard mitigation planning is the cornerstone of project development. And this is a result of congressional requirement, by the way, through the Disaster Mitigation Act of 2000, which was signed into law shortly before the end of the Clinton administration. And it was a mitigation act that resulted from our pilot project impact program, which promoted grassroots hazard mitigation planning and awareness and preparedness and projects at the local level. So a FEMA-approved hazard mitigation plan is required to apply for and receive project funding, which means you have to have a FEMA-approved plan by the application deadline, and that plan has to still be in effect at the time the project is awarded. We can delay award if you're doing a plan update for a little bit, but not too long because of the way the periods of performance are set. The period of performance used to run 3 years from the date of award. It doesn't anymore. The period of performance runs 3 years from the date the selections are announced. So if you need a year before we do an award because you're working on a plan update, that gives you only 2 years left to implement the project. And as Brenna pointed out last week, projects should come out of that plan. If the hazard mitigation planning process is done right, the community, the tribe, the local government, state government, whoever it is that's doing the planning will identify hazard vulnerabilities in the existing built environment and suggest things that need to be done to address those. So oftentimes very specific projects are identified. We've seen buyout of this neighborhood, okay, as an example. We've seen more generic things that are like we need to upgrade stormwater facilities throughout the eastern part of the city, or, for example, with the Skokomish tribe, we need a stormwater facility developed to relieve flooding pressure on the administrative area where all of their facilities are located, the clinic, the tribal headquarters, the emergency preparedness, and everything. So those are kind of a little bit more generic. We've done seismic retrofits, flood buyouts, stormwater management, where they were clearly referred to in policy objectives, but were not called out as individual specific projects. So FEMA says the project must be consistent with your hazard mitigation plan. That means it's either called out as a specific project or it is in agreement with one of the policy objectives that are identified in the plan. So hazard mitigation plan, that's one. Project scoping. So in the hazard mitigation planning process, we strongly promote use of this wonderful, wonderful tool on the FEMA website called Mitigation Ideas. This is an absolutely phenomenal product. It has got so many different ideas that are actual experiences from tribes and cities and counties and states and territories around the U.S. There's a lot of ideas that are not fundable by hazard mitigation assistance grant programs, but that doesn't mean they shouldn't be in the hazard mitigation plan, because the hazard mitigation plan should guide the community toward all kinds of funding resources to meet the needs of the community. We fill a niche for certain specific project types. Fortunately, a lot of project types, but there's a lot of other things, especially regard to preparedness and community education, that can be best funded under maybe private philanthropic organizations, maybe it's through the Indian Health Services, whatever. There's other ways to do that. So this Mitigation Ideas is absolutely wonderful. It even includes urban heat, island effect, sea level rise, a variety of different things that really show that the folks who worked on this back about 3-4 years ago were really forward-thinking, and this was created for use in the hazard mitigation planning process. The mitigation process. So phase 1, mitigation planning, hazard mitigation planning, the community identifies the need for action. Phase 2 is what we're going to talk about right now, project scoping. Phase 3 is going to be the next unit, which is application development. So project scoping involves a couple of things. One is looking at what the problem is. Oftentimes that involves the assistance of a consulting engineer. You develop alternatives. In developing those alternatives, you look at costs, you look at environmental impacts, you look at feasibility, you look at community engagement. Does the community support this, or does the community support that instead? And if you're designing a project for the Hazard Mitigation Assistance grant programs that FEMA provides, does it meet the PDM grant program requirements? Most tribes, most of the funding that they receive will be in the form of direct pre-disaster mitigation grants from FEMA. Most tribes also, some states this is a problem, but it's not in 90% of them. Tribes are also eligible to apply through the state, to the state. The state is a pass-through entity for projects that result from a disaster declaration in their community. And we now can do direct declarations for tribes as well if they are set up to deal with it. It's an option. Smaller tribes often choose to go through the state because the state's used to doing this whole thing with FEMA, and there's all the rules and regulations and you name it. But a tribe that has maybe a larger tribe, maybe a tribe that has a really strong financial system, maybe some really progressive leadership. We just did a declaration for the Colville Reservation here in Washington State. It's a direct disaster declaration to the Colville. It does not go through the state of Washington. So anyway, wanted to mention that to you. A little aside, you're going to see more and more of those as the years come to pass. This has already happened several times in Region 8 in North Dakota and South Dakota area. There have been tribes in that part, the upper Great Plains, that have been direct declarations. Okay, so you define the problem, you brainstorm potential alternatives, you establish some criteria for reviewing those alternatives, you then evaluate the alternatives against those criteria, and you choose a preferred alternative. So, major considerations when scoping alternatives include community support. I've just come back from a couple of conferences that cannot overemphasize the need for projects to be developed through the community, through community engagement at the very beginning of the process, so that when the time comes to implement a project, it has the community support, number one, but number two, people were sharing with us from various locations, and these were tribal situations, where the projects turned out much better because of that community engagement. They were, the staff were made aware of issues and concerns they did not know about as they worked on designing the project. So it was a better project for their community because of the engagement early in the process. Technical feasibility. You know, how do you deal with sea level rise? Well, you know, one thing we could do is build a dam across the Strait of Juan de Fuca and prevent it from rising into Puget Sound. Well, is that feasible? No. Cost and local funding. Cost is always huge. You have to look at grant opportunities, and you also have to look at what is your local funding capability. Most grants, as you well know, from federal agencies have match requirements. For tribes in the Pre-Disaster Mitigation Grant Program, it's often only 10%. Depends on the tribe, but most tribes qualify as small and impoverished communities, and they get a 90-10 cost share. Other tribes qualify only for 75-25 cost share. And it depends on whether they meet the small and impoverished community standards or not. Cost effectiveness for FEMA projects is critical. It may be less critical for a tribe because you can look at the standard measures of cost effectiveness and then include your own human and cultural costs into the equation to determine whether it's an effective project for your community or not, if you're doing the funding yourself or you're getting a funding stream that, unlike FEMA, doesn't require proving that it's a cost-effective project. Environmental effects. You know, some projects have way less impact on the environment than others. Many projects actually benefit the environment. I think of a situation right now where a tribe on the Washington coast wants to build basically a ginormous retaining wall along one side of an existing facility to protect it from a land slippage. And we've encouraged them to look at alternatives. Dewatering the top of the slope and then heavily planting with trees and shrubs all along the slope to hold the slope in place, i.e. green infrastructure. And then the gray infrastructure up at the top would be piping the water away so that the water doesn't collect at the top of the slope and undermine that slope, literally saturate it with wetness and cause it to slide. So we're asking to look at something different because that has not only less environmental effect but a lot of environmental benefit. And only you can tell whether the historic or cultural impacts of various projects will be positive or negative. So what to consider when selecting a project, and again, this is for our grant programs. You may find a project that you really want to do doesn't fit our grant programs. Do it. Find the other funding sources that will help you do that project. If you've identified that project as meeting community goals, you need to do everything you possibly can to find funding for it. Oftentimes, we can fund a part of a project that we could not fund the whole project for, okay? Like, for example, Murdovick and Newtok in Alaska. Newtok traded land with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service to move their village from a very flood-prone and erosion-prone, high erosion hazard location on the Ninglick River to high ground on an island several miles away. The new town site's called Murdovick. The village originally proposed to us moving the old houses to the new town site. That was going to be horrendously expensive, something on the order of a couple $100,000 per house. Those houses were old. They were 30 to 40 years old. They were not built to current energy standards. Some of them had suffered some flood damage. All of them had been subject to some severe winter damage over the years, and we said, you really need new housing. We can't pay for the new housing. So guess what? They went to the Denali Commission and worked with them, and they worked out a solution to get renovated barracks pods from Joint Base Elmendorf-Richardson near Anchorage, renovated and converted to houses that would then be barged to Murdovick and put on the new town site. What we could fund was the building pads for those new homes. And so here we have a project that we're helping fund. It's about $500,000 because even those building pads are about $40,000 a piece because they have to excavate through the tundra to bedrock, and they have to bring in, you know, it's not, it's complicated building in tundra conditions in rural Alaska. So we were able to do that, and other people were able to do other things. And one of our sister grant programs helped pay to buy out the homes that are being replaced by the new housing that's coming into Murdovick. So again, we actually had two different grant programs working on two different elements of a project, and then major funding streams from other federal agencies coming into it to do the things that we could not do. Other things to consider: the cost estimate. Is it reasonable? Is it thorough? Project has to be cost effective. We're looking at the hazard vulnerability and the actual damage history, multiple hazards or only one. Environmental and historic preservation, fish and wildlife. Do you have endangered species in the project site area? Are they going to be impacted? Or is it going to impact wetlands? Is it going to infringe on floodplains? Or can you restore wetlands and floodplains as part of the project? What are the cultural resources that you are aware of that you need to protect? Maybe there is historic structures as well. Many tribes have historic structures. Public support, talked about that as well. Here's an example of evaluating a project, alternatives versus various criteria. So this shows you future flood impacts, project costs, maintenance costs, cultural historic preservation, other hazard risks, etc., whether it was for elevating a flood-prone structure or doing a buyout of a flood-prone structure, okay? So I did some scoping there. Again, I said it was going to be basic, but I think it was really good to share that with you before we talk about putting an application together. And before we do that, I also want to talk about the grant life cycle. So for a pre-disaster mitigation project sub-application that is prepared, you have to identify the project and scope it out and document it. You prepare an application, which is actually, again, a sub-application in eGrants. You can prepare a project sub-application in eGrants that describes what you're proposing to do and to which you upload all of the documents supporting your project, talking about the benefits, etc. Then there is an application review and evaluation that FEMA primarily does, but we do work with the tribe on correcting things, gaining better understanding. Sometimes budgets have to be tweaked. Sometimes there's even project tweaking that has to occur as a result. We'll have our environmentalists will come in and say, if you did it this way, it's going to have way less impact than if you did it this way. And usually we can accommodate those design changes as long as they don't cost more. Sometimes they cost less. Then we make the grant award. That's a big hoop-de-doo. That starts the whole process of having to document all of the transactions that occur after the grant award, doing quarterly reporting, etc. Then you have your activity implementation, getting the project done, and when the project's done, compiling all of the necessary documentation to close out the project, and that is sent back to FEMA so that we can do a grant closeout for you. Okay, so that's the basic life cycle. Look to your state counterparts. State emergency management offices have staff that work on our various grant programs, and they have shown a sincere willingness to work with tribes to help scope things out. Or go to your university. Sometimes there's a tribal consortium. Maybe there's another tribe that's done a similar project. Those are usually the best people. Oftentimes local governments in your area have done similar projects and would be more than happy to share their experience and help you scope out a project. So there's a lot of resources out there.
Continued in the next section.